Welcome to Panelism, the podcast where we talk about the comics and graphic novels worth having on your shelf, and sometimes more. I'm Taylor Trask.
I'm Todd A.
And Todd, it is June. Somehow we cruise through April and May, and I've lost all sense of time. So we're back. And apologies to our listeners. We've been a little hit and miss when it comes to episodes lately. It's just between it being just very busy in both of our lives. I think trying to find the kinds of episodes that work in a climate where, we're still dealing with COVID. We're still dealing with some of those things. And at the same time, if you're listening to this in the future, we're in the middle of a very significant, relevant discussion about race and the police and economics and social justice and all these things. So it's just kind of like, it doesn't seem quite as appropriate to talk about the Avengers during this in a sort of less serious way. So we've been a little bit hesitant to kind of keep up business as usual. I guess, is that a fair statement?
Completely fair. And I think we've mentioned on a couple of shows, I think people probably feel the same fatigue with the world that we do. It's honestly hard to just sort of carve out time to say, this is my reading time. It's like, sure. I almost feel like I need constant distraction to avoid dealing with the real world, which inevitably leads to like a crash, by not dealing with it. Like then the anxiety just builds up and stuff. But I'm happy with what we did here this week, which was we had a listener, a friend of mine, suggest to us that we should probably just talk about books written by people of color, especially Black authors. Mm-hmm. And we really took that to heart. And so that's what we're going to do today.
Yeah, we'll get into that in just a minute. Before that, though, there has been some news of worth noting in the comics and comics industry world or comics adjacent world.
Especially because we talked a lot about this in our last episode.
Yeah. And so you had sent me this link earlier in the week, and by now I'm sure it's pretty well known, but DC is cutting ties with Diamond Distribution very soon, like as of this month. They're going to use either, I forget who they're using for traditional, I think Penguin maybe for like hardcover graphic novels, and then another smaller entity for all their regular weekly issues. But they're cutting ties with Diamond. There's a great article we can link to in the show notes. Kind of talks about this. I think it's the Hollywood Reporter. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. But what that article brings up that I was a little shocked by was that Diamond had withheld monthly payments or some amount of payments to DC, and I'm guessing to other publishers. That was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back when it comes to DC pulling out. Like Diamond had shut down, and probably rightfully so, for a period of time. But the fact that they were not paying DC, for books distributed is a little bit concerning.
Yeah.
What did you think about that?
We've had a real roller coaster, a real journey with Diamond, right? Like, seriously, we kind of badmouthed them in a couple of episodes because we wondered, we didn't understand the situation. We thought, well, this is ridiculous that there's one distributor that's bottlenecking all of this. Not that I thought they should be distributing physical issues during this time. Yeah. Then we mentioned them in the last show because there was a episode of Fat Man Beyond where he talked to the owner of Diamond who said, hey, we want competition in this area. But then at the time we didn't know they were withholding payments. It's obvious that like, I think what I recall from the article was that this was already sort of on the agenda for DC to determine the future when the pandemic struck. So when Diamond, when their only source of distribution shut down and that source withheld payment to the company, it was like, okay, this is a no-brainer. We've got to find an alternative to this. So I don't know what to think about this. On one hand, competition is good. Maybe this opens up some opportunities for indie publishers, but it may also sort of like kneecap, the biggest distributor that was putting a lot of indie publishers on a kind of even keel with the two big names,
Yeah, it could result in Diamond just focusing more on indie stuff. So maybe more smaller niche companies or brands get distribution where they hadn't before. That could be an interesting result. I did want to clarify though, DC during Diamond's hiatus, decided to create two smaller companies, Lunar Distribution and USC Comics Distributors. And so strangely, you'd think they would just be DC Comics Distribution. You'd think they just keep it all on brand. But they created those two companies to handle periodical distribution while Diamond was closed. All of this is in the article. So it's DC is working on it. My guess is Marvel is not far behind if they're not already in motion. Yeah. And I would even imagine Image might be thinking along the similar, same lines. Image is very loosely distributed. Like Image is the organizational structure of Image is very loose. It's not quite like DC, so that might be a little different. But Marvel, I would imagine, is following it. I'm going to go back to a point I made earlier. I think on the last episode we talked about Diamond. Wouldn't surprise me in the least if DC and Marvel both do. DC's already done it, but Marvel does it, and then we see both of those companies just start their own comic shops or start to buy up comic shops in different markets to have a complete end-to-end control of all aspects of the medium, for them. So it's. Some of these things might be on the horizon that we never thought of before. And maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. It remains to be seen.
Now, and one of the comments I saw, which I can't restate in as much clarity as it was first expressed, was, someone brought up that very point, because I saw this as a thread on Reddit, and someone brought up that very point of like, well, Marvel's next. They're going to jump ship. And then the next commenter said, well, why would Marvel leave, though? Now they have the power of Diamond all to themselves. And it was like, oh, right. In a good, bad way of like, DC really is pioneering here, I guess. Yeah. But the other thing I learned from that article was that this distribution relationship isn't really that old. What did it say? Is it only 30 years or something like that? Or is that, maybe that's even
only 30 longer years, 25 years, 25 years,
25 years. Yeah. So you think it was just in the mid 90s that this appeared. Comics survived for a long time before Diamond.
Well, Diamond was always around, but like the consolidation sort of happened in the 90s, late 90s too. So I never thought about Marvel having more to gain from this. That's an interesting angle.
It is. I tend to agree with you, and I don't know shit about business, but I tend to think that like they're probably going to want their own solution because, in the sense that like they need alternatives. If one does get shut down, they can't be bottlenecked like getting their comics out. So I hope we've seen like such a great quality of digital comics, and in our discussion last time, I sort of flip-flopped my position, which is I think I'm going to use Comixology for a lot of single issues and only go print when I want a collection. But even just saying that out loud, I think, no, they need my support for the single issues. Oh, God, I'm so torn.
It's hard, man. It's hard. It helps that there are some stores that do a great job of offering variant covers. Yeah. To like Muse Comics here in town in the Springs is a great example. Like they're kind of my go-to. I love Escape Velocity. We've shouted them out many times, but Muse more often than not really focuses on variants. And I think to their credit, so that I know, going back to Decorum one more time, like that Decorum variant that I have is amazing. I would want that physically, not digitally. So like I think it creates more incentive to be creative and to really, I think, offer something. If I'm going to buy something physically, the souvenir of the thing, like really from both the publisher standpoint and then the comic shop standpoint, really orient around creating a unique experience that digital isn't ever going to provide you. And maybe we'll see more of that. Maybe more variants, more interesting variants come down the pike too.
I agree. You can't get away from the fact that like at its heart, comics are different from other media because someone is putting like an ink on paper. Yeah. Like even if the artists now are doing that more through digital means, it's still represented in its final medium. You know what I mean? Is like when it was created, it was someone putting a pencil on a piece of paper, and when it gets to you, it's ink on paper. Whereas music was never going to be delivered to you through a guitar that played itself or something like that. Maybe my metaphor is getting lost here, but it's the comics medium is very, very pure, and so I think there's always going to be something with that physical.
Even more so than like regular books too, because you're reading a text on a Kindle is actually, in my opinion, superior. Like just text with no imagery is superior than a poorly formatted paperback or even sometimes a poorly formatted hardcover. Comics, like the medium itself, and Alan Moore has gone to great extent to be like, there's things you can do in the comics medium physically printed out that you cannot do in any other medium, even the digital side of it. So it is kind of this unique, very unique, it's in this unique kind of place where, music stores probably don't, with the exception of like the really kind of niche indie vinyl ones, really don't need to have a store that has pieces of plastic that you go and buy, like that. You can just have that on your phone. You're still hearing it, to various quality. You're hearing it, the same way. It doesn't. You're not having to sit there and like hold the thing in your hand while you're listening. It's a little different.
Yeah, and more than books, they are designed. Books tend to be, I have so many books that I've later in life realized like this is a bad user experience because it wasn't designed. Boy, that's a rabbit hole I could fall down. We do have other DC news.
And just quick little things. We'll get to our books in just a minute, but it's worth noting too that this was the weekend Wonder Woman 1984 was supposed to come out, and has been pushed to August 14th, but that's still highly dependent on if theaters are open. Do you imagine that date sticks? Do you imagine we're going to have that, or do you think that will be? Do you think this ultimately just gets dropped on HBO Max this autumn?
Hope not. I mean, it does. From what we saw in the trailers, like it looks like this is a big superhero movie that deserves like a big showing. But and maybe I'm overlooking this for better or worse, but I have not heard a lot about how theaters are going to reopen. So I've heard that a lot about restaurants, 50% capacity and like literally just taking tables out of the places and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know anything about theaters, and they certainly can't take seats out. And what are they to do if, a bunch of people get in there and don't want to follow the recommendations? It's tough. And which really hurts because that was such a refuge of mine, to like literally walk across the street and just take in a matinee. And now I feel like I'm not sure when that's going to happen again and if it's going to be safe to do that. So
the summer movie season, as I mentioned before many times, as frothy as it can be, was always kind of a staple of my year. Like, I know I'll be seeing some really exciting, interesting, fun thing, once every 2 weeks, and going into either the Alamo Draft House or my local theater. So that I haven't stepped in a theater since February to see a movie. And it's kind of like, wow, that's, we'll get back there. The Alamos of the world will definitely continue on, but we may see a good chunk of spaces go away, and maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing. The other thing I want to mention is we are back to having sort of a community book club this month, and we will be, I think very appropriately so, reading the books March book 1 and book 2 as part of our June book club. There is a book 3 which completes the series, just for I think to give us enough to focus on in an episode. We'll just be covering books 1 and 2, but definitely get book 3 if you have it too, or if you can. Just a quick sort of summary. This is kind of the autobiography of John Lewis, who was one of the key 5 or 6 people involved in the civil rights movement. He was in his early 20s when he marched with King, and these books kind of detail his life, but also give you a very, very dramatic, accurate look into race relations and police and just where the nation was in the 60s. And having been born after that, it's actually, for me, it was probably the first time I was able to really finally put myself in that headspace, put myself in that place, that space and time, kind of understand what's going on. So you, Todd, you haven't read them yet. It'll be a great discussion, I think, for us to have. We're going to record that podcast on June 20th and put it out on the 24th. So it gives you time to go pick up March book 1 and 2 and join us for that discussion.
Yeah, excellent. I've already bought mine on Comixology and I'm ready to dive in.
Fantastic. Do you want to tee up our discussion today? Because we've got several books which we're talking about, but they're all kind of centered around the idea of just I think all things political graphic novels, I think.
Yeah, I sigh and let out an exasperated chuckle because it's like, where do you begin? This has been such a heavy week. And one thing you and I didn't talk about in our pre-show stuff is that I've listened to several podcasts that have addressed what's going on in terms of like an entertainment podcast where they they made a statement about why they were releasing an episode this week, and honestly, it's just so heavy that I don't know that we need to say anymore other than to just focus on creators who are Black or persons of color and say, hey, we're reading you and we're listening to you, and we don't want this to be a one-off book club kind of thing. Like this is something we're going to pay more attention to, and I think we really try to have a lot of diversity in the books that we cover. Often where I think that comes out for you and I is that we often look at it more in terms of like female creators versus male creators or something. So this week just gave us a really, just a bleak opportunity to say, what are we not covering, and look at it. And I mean, I was so happy when I suggested it to you because my friend who suggested that we do this gave a list of several books, not all of which she had read. And when I sent that list over to you, you immediately had a list of other books by people of color. And it was like, oh, that's so amazing because I don't know. I just liked that there was immediately like a swell of ideas around that and how to put the spotlight on that. And then, I'll like I was saying to you in the pre-show, and I said I'll try to hold off on this, is that it's just everything is just so much right now. Yeah. And I don't mean that as an excuse that we can't pay attention to what Black voices are saying. I just mean that it was hard for me to sort of it is hard for me in this pandemic to be able to focus on an emotional response to anything. Mm-hmm. Because it's so desperate, and this was making this homework was a good way for me to sit down and go like, okay, here's 2 hours of me reading a book where I'm not going to think about anything else but the subject of this book. And so yeah, I read a book this week that my friend recommended, which was Incognegro. The author is Matt Johnson. And the artist is Warren Pleece. And it is the story of a journalist from Harlem who passes for white and goes to the Deep South in the era of lynchings and covers lynchings as his byline in the Harlem papers is Incognegro. Nobody knows who this author is. And it just has this really interesting origin story, which is Matt Johnson. His mother is African American and his father is white. And he talks about how he grew up in a predominantly African American neighborhood. And this edition of the book is amazing, too, because it was published in 2007. They re-released it in 2017. So there is an afterword from the Trump era. That, puts this in this context of like, Jesus Christ, like I saw it, not to divert again, but I saw, I don't know where to go with that. Never mind. I just can't believe that like in my lifetime, this is like, it is absurd that we are still having to have these conversations in the sense that it is an indisputable fact that policing is racist and the police are militarized and that our institutions were based on, racist ideas and things like that. This is just, it's hard to comprehend because I remember sitting around as a freshman discussing Spike Lee's movies, and, we're finally having this conversation. And during the Rodney King riots thinking like, we're finally having this conversation. This is fucking 30 years after that. Yeah. Like my whole lifetime is that. And I think of our parents' age and their entire life has been this. Oh my God. Anyway, sorry. I'm,
no, it's quite all
getting
right.
distracted because it's so much to pour into this moment.
Well, it's a lot to take in because you're like, yeah, here we are again, same as it ever was. And granted, at the same time, though, I want to be very, very clear. There has been a lot of progress made since, the 1800s, since 1968, since 1992. There's been a lot of progress to the point where a black woman was finally elected as mayor of Ferguson, Missouri, kind of the place that kicked off all of this. Is finally seeing some really good news come down the pike. A woman of color, first black mayor in their history, actually first woman in their history too. So there's been good things. It's almost like we're kind of in the last, 10 to 15% of the work, and it's the hardest 10 to 15% that needs to be done. So it feels it feels harder. It feels both more meaningful, but also like, I just want to really make sure we're acknowledging this isn't a lost cause. Progress has happened. Good things are occurring. We're still in it, but we're pushing ahead. And it's just, I think some of these books that we're talking about, both to remind us of that, but also it's kind of depressing to be like, wow, we're still at it. Okay. All right.
Well, and whether it's hopeful thinking or even more grim thinking, I do wonder if we're if everything about the Trump era and the pushback and this frustration coming to a head at this moment is because that racist era of politics is in its death throes with our generation and the generations beneath us. Like, is that what we are seeing now? Is the dying off of that boomer attitude and the silent generation attitude of like, it was always better back when, like, are we finally pushing through that? I guess I hope that that's the case and that's why, but it definitely feels like we're in a moment now,
Yeah.
And sorry to divert on this, but to tie it back in, one of the great things I read this week was the story of how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Persuaded Nichelle Nichols to stay on Star Trek as Lieutenant Uhura.
Oh, that's
and say, we need your representation on TV every week. And that's just such a cool story of how like what now we think of as like purely geek culture was, it was pop culture. There wasn't so much culture in the 60s that Star Trek could be easily put into a niche of, geekism or something. Yeah. And so, front and center on Friday nights or whatever, like there was Nichelle Nichols and playing a lieutenant in space, in the future. And what a cool idea that is. To focus back on the book I read, Matt Johnson has this interesting story, as I mentioned, because his mother was African-American, his father was white. So he talks about growing up in in sort of the Black Power era in the 70s in this African-American neighborhood. And so like his mom tried to help him fit in, but he looked white. And he had, his hair was almost blonde. It was mostly straight. And he had a cousin who was also half black and half Jewish. And they made up this little game where they would go incognegro, pretending to be race spies in the war against white supremacy. So he talks about how he kind of, forgot about that after his childhood. And he went to college. And it wasn't until then when he learned that Walter White, the head of the NAACP, could also pass as white. And in the early 20th century, he would go undercover as a white man in the Deep South to investigate lynchings, which, again, and I'll touch on this in our discussion, something I didn't know. I didn't know that story. So he had this moment of connection in college with that story of like, oh, wow, this was a thing that, happened. And then he talks about, well, then take that further. And in 2005, he had twins, Matt Johnson, the writer. And one of them is brown skinned and has black hair. And the other is very pale, pink skin and has this more European sort of hair. And all of these ideas sort of come together. And the story of Incognegro is that story of this journalist who can pass as white, goes to the Deep South to investigate lynchings. And I don't want to get too much into it, but there's definitely a familial relationship that you find out about, like, I'm not giving any spoilers here, but we find his brother factors into this, the character in the book, I mean, and his brother cannot pass as white. His brother looks very African. So when their parents were, there's a sort of a flashback sort of story, not even a flashback, but a story that the character tells in flashback of like, that's why father sent me to Harlem and said, like, you can make it out of here, but you can just see it was such a neat story to see that it's written here in the 21st century, with this writer with this very specific heritage, putting that story back in context of the era of lynchings. And it is like, I mean, it is just a page turner. Like it is, it is, oh man, I'm trying to contextualize it in other comic works, it reads like nonfiction, I guess is what I want to say. Like it reads almost like, what do I want to say? Like some of the scenes may have been, combinations of things that happen to the author or to, other historical events that have been sort of put into this. Like it just reads so true to life in that way.
Got it. Okay.
And it also manages to take these turns that aren't wild, crazy turns, but are so fitting and so dangerous because of that scale. I guess that's what it is that it is a bit hard, and certainly it's a bit hard for me as a white man to put myself in that moment of like, when was it dangerous to go to the Deep South? Where I grew up in the South, I wouldn't say the Deep South, and I definitely grew up in an urban environment, but obviously I don't have any of that context at all. But what this book did was like, I felt that danger. I felt like, what is this guy doing? This guy could be murdered at any instant. And the crux of the story, like, and also it's just like great. It's like great screenwriting too. It's just this economy and pacing of the story where we see him finishing reporting on one story as he witnesses a lynching and does this amazing, like, comeuppance to the white people in attendance because they're all posing for pictures with this dead black body. And the character tells them, hey, I work with the photographer and we'll send your copies to you. What's your name and address? So then when he gets back to Harlem, he publishes the names and addresses of every person in attendance at that lynching. Whether that's an element that he got from true life or not, I don't know, but it is harrowing, just like, you just felt like what a moment of revenge. So then of course he tells his publisher, it's a very J. Jonah Jameson relationship where he says, that's you have promised me an office and a column with my name on it. I'm tired of being an anonymous author. I want to make something of myself. And the publisher says, well, you're going to want to report on this event. And he hands him a news clipping. So he's back on the next train to go back to Alabama or whatever. And that's the case that involves his brother. Mm-hmm. What he doesn't know is that one of his friends, who is also light-skinned and can sort of pass as white, jumps on the train as well because he wants to make a name for himself. So then you have this added layer of danger of like, here's a guy who's not used to what the main character is used to, not used to confronting that racism like right up front. So he's kind of a wild card. He can't stay quiet. And it was riveting. And
do you think some of that insight, because looking at Matt Johnson's kind of bio, his mother is African American, his father was Irish Catholic, so mixed race kid. Do you think that perspective put him in a unique... By the way,
that statement alone, because I saw that too, says so much about the way we talk about race.
Yeah.
Why can't an Irish Catholic person be black?
It can be. I mean, he totally can be black. Yeah.
But the fact that they identify that his father that way in Wikipedia, I mean, this is not you and I identifying this. That's the Wikipedia entry, says that we think of Irish Catholics as white people.
Yeah.
Like, which is such a strange thing. Anyway, I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
But he has, I mean, he has quite a body of work that speaks to both the Black experience, but sort of how it just, if you go to his kind of bibliography, and you're going to see a lot of work outside of even Incognegro. I wonder if him being able to straddle both sides of that line and kind of growing up and being sort of the product of two worlds, if that doesn't give him, and maybe I'm asking just because I'm curious, do you think that gives him the ability to tell a Black story in a way that white people will empathize with more? And that hit you kind of more so than it would be. Not that you can't empathize with a Black story from a totally Black author, but there's a thing I've noticed where mixed race people living in both worlds really they can synthesize these elements in ways that I think can often be more profound or more more impactful than otherwise. Where do you fall on that? How do you feel about that?
That's a really interesting question, because I do feel like, and the reason I led off with that origin story of like what Matt Johnson says in his foreword is because that it's definitely a story that like only he could tell. You know, he could put himself in those shoes of the story, and I think that's what allows us to get into it. So I don't know that it's hard to say there's any I wouldn't say there's like specific elements that like, you know, we're able to sort of cross that racial divide. I mean, my God, I know I'm like, you know, inherently biased in all sorts of ways. But I don't think it was like he made an appeal to white readers in that way.
Okay.
I think it was more about just that raw honesty and opening with that forward, so you knew like this was a man who lived in that world, and so he can tell you like, I don't know, it drew me in because I felt like, you know, that fear of like, this is the author saying, what if I had been born, you know, 50, 60 years earlier, I would be Zane Pinchback, that writer, the Incognegro writer.
Yeah.
So he's saying like, that would be me. You know, would I go through with all of these things? Would I keep putting myself in that danger? And then to think like, well, he has twins and he's putting them in that sense of like, what if one of the twins, you know, could pass as white and one of them could not? How far does the one twin go to, you know, to save the other one from these? Like, it was just, it was a great reflection on everything that's going on currently, and, you know, led me to a lot of self-reflection as well. And one of the things that was startling to me was I don't know a lot about lynchings, and I grew up in the South.
Yeah.
And so I kept thinking about that, and what will possibly blow people away is I came up with this. This is such, oh my God, such a distilled example of institutionalized racism. When I was a senior in high school, in our American history class, we did not cover the Civil War.
Oh my goodness.
So we did not cover it for two stated reasons. And I you know, let's take my teacher at his word, like in good faith, and say these reasons make sense. One is, it was an AP history class, and he said it does not appear on the AP exam. Like, they do not focus on the Civil War. So we're teaching towards the exam. And number two was, he said, you've had this in every year of your schooling. So you know, it's like, it's hard to deny that he's right in both of those facts, but it's also, I think, at this point, impossible to deny that the institutionalization of that was that I, a middle-class white boy, did not have an intellectual look at the Civil War as a young adult. And you add to that I went to a private school, and there were only two Black kids in my class. Now, granted, my class was really tiny, but to have, you know, that few in number, and to say we're going to ignore the most significant thing, you know, in all of American history, is a little outrageous.
Yeah.
And I think at this point, it's like, it's just, to me, that's like, that is the banality of institutionalized racism. They say like, there's a logic to it, but what it still does is denies you a look at that. Because why does what I learned about the Civil War in 4th grade matter as I'm going into 12th grade? And then to think that I went to college in Chicago the next year, which is a place where I guarantee all the local students there had a very different understanding of the Civil War and race relations. Just
I'm gonna put a pin in here real quick too, because there's a book I'll talk about where I had a similar situation. It's amazing what isn't included in just a typical traditional K-12 curriculum that is absolutely both imperative to our history, our recent history, but also imperative to how we understand where we've come from and what's been done and how we make it better, how we improve that going forward. It's so many key events. I'll just quick teaser, the Tulsa, Oklahoma incident, which appears in a book I'm going to talk about. Like not once was that even mentioned. I was well into my late 20s before I even knew that was a thing.
Well, I mean, for Christ's sake, I was in my 40s when I learned about it through The Watchmen.
Yeah.
That is shameful. You know? And
in some ways it's not your fault in particular, just because you don't know what you don't know and you don't even know where to search it out. It's by pure coincidence that, I mean, one of the genius things about graphic novels as a medium, as comics as a medium, is it makes it easier to distribute these stories in an engaging, theatrical way, in an artistic way that you can empathize with more than a book. Because a book could tell that same story and do a good job of it, but seeing these things actually on page, seeing the art from the artist's point of view, like depicted in a particular way, adds an extra level of context that creates either empathy or creates rage or whatever it's meant to do from a story perspective. Comics does it. The only thing better than comics to do that thing would be TV or movies. Although, as I say that out loud, I almost wonder maybe comics is even better than that, because it gives you the ability to pause, to consider a frame, to consider a panel, before it doesn't move on. You control the pacing of the story. Yeah. Whereas TV kind of pulls you along for the ride. You get the benefits of both the visual, but also the ability to control the flow and the timing of it. So you really get a truly controlled experience where you can get the most out of it. I'm going to talk about rather some political and relevant graphic novels here in a minute, where I would never have known this point of view had it not been for these books in this medium. No TV show would have given me that same level of sort of consideration. So I think Incognegro is what a great example of this to start off with, because you have an author who's coming from a very particular background, telling a very specific story that you would only get from that kind of an author, that kind of a background. And it's just, I'm even like, as you're talking, I'm flipping through some of the artwork itself. Like, I'll definitely grab this when we're done. It's going to do a lot for me as it did for you. It just really puts you in let you time travel to a place that in a time and a situation that you would never have access to otherwise, and kind of live in it with that author from that point of view. Yeah.
And the art we've got to touch on, all black and white, a very simple style, but the emotion of the characters, I think, is conveyed so well in it. There's so many tiny things that the artist does that aren't like, they're not like trying to be clever or something. It's just the way something's framed, or the look on one of the characters' face or something as a line of dialogue is delivered, where I felt it that much more. If this had been in color, if it had been, inked or colored in that way that modern comics are done, it would have pulled me out of the moment for sure.
Yeah.
Although I haven't read a lot by them, I was thinking of, Guy Delisle.
Yep. Oh yeah. The Pyongyang and all those kinds of books.
And also some, oh my God, I'm trying to remember the is it Tezuko? Sorry, a Japanese artist. That manga style from the 60s and 70s.
Oh yeah.
And where it was not super based, but or I mean maybe it's even the 80s, but it's that the guy that wrote Pushcart Man. Just that black and white, like this is a raw telling of this. The book I read, Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, that drawn in quarterly style, like this.
Yeah,
it was all of that, like I said, like that nonfiction style. And yeah, it just got the story across in such a great way. And one of those things where,
real quick, I'm frankly surprised Drawn and Quarterly did not publish this. This is Berger Books, as far as I can tell. It just seems like one of those things that Drawn and Quarterly would have gobbled up immediately. Maybe this was before their time. Oh no, it's 2018. Never mind. It came out in 2018. Yeah, it's interesting. I've never even heard of Berger Books. I wonder what that might just be a regular book publisher. Yeah,
I was just quickly oh my gosh, it was Yoshihiro Tatsumi is who I was
there we go.
Who wrote The Pushman and other stories. And I was trying to think of the awards that this won, or just the recognition that it got, the Incognegro. The publisher was Vertigo, actually.
Was it? Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it may have been through that other label that it was distributed.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, one thing I wanted to touch on, and it was his afterword, which was, as I mentioned, he wrote it in 2017 on the republication of the book, and he writes it during that Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville.
Oh, wow.
So he was looking at it and saying, like, this is this, we're watching racial terrorism again. And I think the moment we're seeing now that's really highlighted at this moment in June 2020 is how that racial terrorism has been institutionalized, by police forces. And like my experience, not learning about the Civil War as a senior in high school, I think very much police departments don't realize what they have not learned. Mm-hmm. And so those individuals within those institutions may not understand that, that there's something that's been overlooked, and that's that's caused this this problem that has exacerbated to this day. In other words, it might not be an overt racism, but that system that's been put in place positively favors one group while negatively, disfavoring another. And Matt, to the point I made, he talks about in that afterward, there wasn't a moment when he wasn't aware of lynchings. And so to think, like, this is a guy that's roughly my age, and I grew up, in the South, not really hearing about lynchings. Like, I knew that it was a thing that existed, but you didn't know the prevalence of it or the violence of it. I knew it was a racist act for sure, but I didn't know that it was a spectacle and that it was all of the further horror that it is.
It's interesting. Yeah. As you're saying that a lot, I almost wonder if some of that obfuscation isn't from a place of shame, isn't from the community going, oh my God, I can't believe we did that. To even talk about it now is just too painful. Let's not even, and not that it's 100% that, but a lot of it is that. Like, we can't, it's just too much for us to even acknowledge this terrible thing. And then it just becomes normal to not acknowledge it. And then by result becomes almost institutionalized, to your point, in its own regard, just because for valid reasons, it was sort of put aside, but it's like, no, you need to lean into that shame. I'm thinking about Germany in World War II. Like, you go visit the Holocaust Museum and they're it's like they have a really hard time being like, yeah, we did this. It's like, that shame is very powerful. It's powerful in that it helps create change, it helps create, progress, but at the same time, it can be a mask that, covers up things that shouldn't otherwise be covered up. So you kind of have to toggle that fine line if you're of the community that historically has to look back and go, oh my God, and America's not, as a country, doesn't handle shame very well. Like, we're so interested in the mythology of America, and like, we do great stuff and we've done a lot of great stuff, but it's like, it's the shame of the shitty stuff that we've done along with the great stuff that's really hard for us to put in the same light. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now is finally acknowledging, yeah, we did all that and we're ashamed of it, and we need to just work through it and try to fix it.
And to your point, what a great medium comics are to look at that, because one of the things you and I point to that got us into comics are those moments where, and sorry for if this analogy sounded kind of crass, but when you learn the superhero is really not all that heroic or that powerful, and that is the problem we're confronting with older generations about America. My parents for sure think America is Superman, and that is not, never has been the case, and you think of those little institutionalized problems that exacerbated and whitewashed and made everything, covered it over for shame or for trying to rewrite history, to the Daughters of Confederacy's legacy of trying to rewrite the history of the Civil War. Yeah. As though all these states that mentioned slavery in their articles of secession were not actually fighting for slavery, that it was somehow states' rights. That bullshit that, like, my parents, like, to a great extent, I mean, sorry, I don't mean to, like, call them out on that, but, like, they buy into that it was states' angry rights phone call or whatever. Later, Todd. I know. Don't worry. They haven't figured out how to listen to a podcast yet. Okay. Right. But, that that's not their personal failing. That's a failing of the educational system around them. And one of the things the Daughters of Confederacy did was go to those Southern public schools and say, we need to tell this story in a different way. And as I understand the story, that's what the DAC did. And so they fucked up all those people's understanding of history. Like, and it's, I don't know if that's, sorry if that's getting off the track, but that's right. That's what we're looking at now, and the Trumpist slogan is we need to make America Superman again. And the rest of us are saying it never was Superman. Like that, everything about the founding of this country was racist. It's interesting you say all this though, Missouri Compromise and the Electoral College and all of those things. As I've said many times,
my entry point back into comics in a big bad way was a combination of really discovering Watchmen, the graphic novel, not the HBO show, but like the original graphic novel, which is nothing but what you expected and what you thought about the superhero genre is incorrect. These are flawed people making flawed decisions. Like, that was interesting to me, as was the more modern take on that, Injustice: Gods Among Us, which right in issue 1 is like, Superman kills the Joker because he loses it. He gets pushed too far and he loses it. And it sets up the emotion. The entirety of that whole series is based on that moment. And the terrible choices Superman keeps making, kind of along his jilted, warped view of what's right and wrong after that moment. So it's, for me, like, that's always interesting. So it's I'm going to now really take seriously this idea that there's a lot of people who do not like Gods Among Us or Injustice: Gods Among Us because Superman is portrayed that way. Yeah. And it's like, we need our Sully, our hero. Yeah. We need, and I get it, right? I get some people need to believe in something. They need to believe in unimpeachable good and unimpeachable, like, characters and all that. And I get that. I think it's just, we need comics to give us that counterpoint now and then, or more, or often enough, where it's like, okay, if you still want to believe in that, great, but understand people are flawed. Human beings are flawed. And here's what can happen when those flaws, become too much or veer us in a different direction. And I don't want to, goodness gracious.
I mean, we could talk about this all day.
Well, I didn't want to draw a clean line between Incognegro and, Injustice: Gods Among Us. That's not what I'm trying to do.
Well, no, I meant it in the other way. Like, I think once we start thinking about this, it's that funny comment I saw on Twitter where someone responded to a feminist saying, well, the problem is, once I start to look at it through this lens, everything looks like it's the patriarchy. And it's like, yeah, dude, it fucking is. Yeah. But I think that's exactly what our podcast is supposed to do. And so, I don't think you're wrong to draw that line from something like this to how people look at Injustice: Gods Among Us. I mean, just that title, Gods Among Us, is like kind of mocking. Yeah. Of like, oh, these are gods among us, really?
Yeah. That's a great point. And just the whole series is just kind of pulling down that notion. Like, no, they're not. Well, they really are. My gosh, I could come up with so many flawed books, but I did want to close what I was talking about with positive suggestions, which is the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund this week in their newsletter sent a great list of anti-racism graphic novels, a reading and resources list. So go to cbldf.org
The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund is like a First Amendment organization that it promotes that discussion and, gosh, what else do we want to call it? Freedom through comic books. Like that is the medium through which they address these things, but they're often involved in legal cases and lawsuits that are much bigger than just comic books, but they see it as, that's their entry into it. So great organization. And they just have an awesome list. Incognegro is on that. And was this the one that also, where they divided up into speculative fiction and realistic fiction. And so going through this, like chalked up a bunch of books like, hey, I'm going to read this. One that I'm really interested in is Bitter Root, which is on Image. And I just noticed on Image, they're only 8 issues into this. So that's like one of those series where I'm like, oh, I'm going to jump into this new series. And anyway, hopefully that's a
big shout out. Well, big shout out to CBLDF too. They're typically in comic shops, you'll see kind of a rack or a table or something that has kind of freebies and giveaways and stuff. And typically the CBLDF has some kind of flyer or something that does a lot of great curation around different themes or topics or things going on. So I've always been a fan. Regrettably, I didn't realize they had a newsletter until just this moment. So I just signed up to get that weekly newsletter too. Thank you for that shout out. I feel bad now because I've been a huge fan of that organization and did not know they had a newsletter.
Well, and that's probably a good moment to say, hey, everybody go check out cbldf.org, because one way that they get a lot of exposure is at Comic Cons, which, as we know, is not happening this year. Mm-hmm. Not just San Diego, but they always have a booth like at every local comic convention. And it's usually staffed by your local comic book shop employees who are volunteering their time. Those are great ways for people to learn about the organization and donate, because they'll always have books signed by the creators, that are, I assume, donated to CBLDF so that they can take all the money from that purchase. And that's just not happening this year. So, for $100, you get a patch and a T-shirt and a cool little card that says you're a member, but you can even donate less than that if you want. So it's a pretty cool place to point to.
Fantastic.
Crazy time.
Awesome.
Oh boy.
Big fan.
What did you read this week? Because I'm like emotionally exhausted from thinking about this.
That's why I wanted you to go first, A, because I knew you'd have a really good take on Incognegro, and 2, because I have a bunch of different books. I'm gonna shout out 4, and I'm not gonna go into as much detail as you did, just for both time and because some of these are actually by white creators, but telling a very powerful black, shedding light on a very powerful black story. So it's a little bit different. And some of these are, I wanted to really kind of delve deeper into comics or graphic novels and just sort of how, politics and graphic novels can really work together to do powerful things. And so I have a very, very diverse array of books. One I'm going to shout out, actually, it's not on the list that I sent you, so it's going to be new to you, but is George Takei's book, They Called Us Enemy.
Thank you.
I
talked over that. It's called They Call Us Enemy.
They Called Us Enemy. Yeah.
George Takei, great book to pull. I'm so glad you're talking about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is a single graphic novel, came out last year. We actually reviewed it in the last Escape Velocity book club before quarantine. We actually discussed this book. And it's really good because it's from George's point of view. When he was a child, he and his family were taken from their homes and put in the Japanese internment camps. And going back and talking about, the history you're not really taught that well in high school. Holy crap. There are a couple key events that I got either just barely mentioned to or no exposure at all to until I was well out of college. And the Japanese internment camps are one of them. Like it's mentioned, but they don't really go into a bunch of detail, which is tragic because South Dakota itself as a state was home to at least 2 of those internment camps, maybe more.
Which is another thing that I have to remind myself of every time. I literally just had to look this up to remind myself of it. Here's a young Japanese American born in Los Angeles, interred in Santa Anita Park and then transferred to Arkansas.
Yeah.
So it's not like they just separated the Japanese from their community but kept them local. They moved them to the middle of the country so that they would not be seen.
Yeah. Yeah. And buses that had, they covered the windows so nobody could see in. Talk about shame. This was a shameful act that people were ashamed of at the time of doing it. And it's like, oh my God. So it is, you get both the actual reality of what it was like to be a child in those camps and spend, a year to two of your life there, and like what you left behind and the tragedy of that. At the same time, it's a little bit, the monotony of being in those camps is very apparent in the book. Some people I've talked to about it said it kind of felt a little boring from time to time. That's because the environment he grew up in was itself very boring. So you kind of have to understand that, like, you're gonna get a very realistic account of what it was like, but from a child's point of view. So it's interesting to see George as a child kind of talking about these things that, as an adult, you read them and go, oh my God, did he realize what was happening? But from a child's point of view, his parents tried really hard to kind of make it seem at least a bit normal, or a bit like it's an adventure, to try to make it less traumatic for the kids. So you kind of get the view from, his child's eyes, but also from, his, as an adult, he's able to go back and empathize with his parents and kind of understand and put context around what they must have been feeling, having to shepherd both themselves through this crisis, but also their children. And you just get a really firm understanding of, wow, America did this to these people not long ago, within the last 100 years. People are still alive who went through it, as either victims or went through it as, soldiers who had to be there. So just, owe it to yourself. During this whole time, understand kind of another point of view from another piece of racial injustice from our history. They called us enemy, George Takei. And if you don't know by this point, George Takei, also of Star Trek fame, my God, think about what that show did for representation in a time when that was barely mentioned at all. Like, hey, we're going to have this sort of revolutionary cast from, all countries. There was a Russian guy on, for God's sake, and that was during the Cold War. Like, there were all these perspectives that were represented. So Star Trek did a lot to, and George Takei, I think takes great pride in the fact that Star Trek did a lot to push the idea of diversity and push, and other points of view and just representation on TV. So
and put those faces on the screen, and not just talk about it. Like, they were starring in those roles. Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely recommend They Called Us Enemy. Another book, this one is from a white author named Don Brown, but unbelievably powerful. It's called The Unwanted: Stories of the Syrian Refugees. I actually grabbed this last year. Escape Velocity has a really good sort of political action kind of curated section that books that are very relevant. And this one in particular caught my eye because I knew very little about the Syrian refugee crisis other than sort of top level news that you'd read, and I knew it wasn't the greatest situation in the world, and there was a lot of strife and a lot of problems. But seeing this, he did a lot. Don Brown does a lot of really thorough investigative research to write his books. He's very prolific as an author, but journalist first and foremost. So taking his journalist training and really getting the firsthand accounts of the Syrians who were had to cross these large bodies of water, large bodies of land, with their families, not knowing if they're ever going to see their home again. For no fault of their own, having to now have their entire life upturned and kind of figure out, what life looks like now and have it constantly be changing. Like, just an incredibly powerful look at what these people are still going through now. Like, this is still a problem now. This hasn't been solved yet. It left me kind of gutted, I don't want to even get into too much detail because it's just one of those books you have to pick up and just experience in one sitting and just sort of reflect on it. He absolutely has probably one of the most rigorous bibliographies I've ever seen of a graphic novel. Everything's expertly sourced. The bibliography itself is probably almost 10 pages just of all the different, newspaper clippings and personal accounts from a variety of refugees themselves. So yeah, it's a white author, but he goes out of his way to really organize and contextualize and harness these stories into a powerful piece. And I'm so glad he did it, because it was something that just as a person alive in 2020, I felt like I owed it to myself to know more about what was going on. And this is something that the news will really never have the time to, the news will never have a time to tell. You can't really do it cleanly in a documentary or a movie. A graphic novel is truly the best way to tell that story. And the art too is it's kind of got a very hand-drawn watercolor vibe to it that fits the stories very, very well. It kind of feels the way some of the text appears over the art kind of gives it sort of a newspaper or journalistic feel anyway. So it does kind of fit together very well. Whereas the George Takei book, the art is very clean and very accessible, kind of not too dissimilar from Incognegro in that it has a kind of a manga-like quality, but it's very much that, they call This Enemy is a story told from a child's point of view. So the art kind of fits that. With the Unwanted, it's very much, you almost could feel like the art was being drawn by one of the refugees as their story was unfolding. Kind of you feel like, wow, this was, this could have been drawn yesterday and these events could be just as fresh. So it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, this looks amazing. I love that this art is so perfect to tell that story.
It has a very high, even if it's a book that if you're not somebody who is accustomed to comics or graphic novels, or you haven't had a lot of experience reading them, I would have no problem handing you this because it's very human stories told very, at a very high level. And I don't think anybody who's not used to comics, you will take something away from this book. I can think of many people who I know who are, not comics readers, but would probably be very, very impacted by this book. So think about that one. I want to also give a shout out to another book also by a white author, but Nate Powell has a collection of all of his pieces called You Don't Say. And it's all of his newspaper, things that he's drawn or written for newspapers or other comics magazines or other things, kind of a nice anthology, a collection of all his different things. They fit together. Oddly enough, they all kind of fit together thematically, loosely, but there's sort of a through line. But there's one particular story I want to draw attention to called Like Hell I Will. And it was drawn originally in 2008 from a copy of Syncopated #4, which was a comics magazine. It came out in 2009. But Like Hell I Will is the first time I ever experienced the Tulsa massacre, and just, knowing what it was, knowing that it happened, just unbelievably, the fact that this is the first time I even knew that was a thing really just shook me to my core. And it actually, the first couple panels start off, on the first page, it says, yes, it's all true. And then it just goes in and kind of gives you a top level, Tulsa's population exploded at the turn of the last century. The mostly black neighborhood of Greenwood was a classic American success story. So just building up this idea that, look, black people, Black Wall Street was in Tulsa. It was, not that long after the Civil War. Here's this group of people that said, okay, we're going to embrace the American dream. We're going to, put all our effort, all our energy, all our knowledge into building a better life for ourselves. Actually got success doing it. Actually, found a way to get a leg up, having, come from this very tragic background. And then the white population of Tulsa burned it all down, literally burned it all down. You see it expertly. I mean, we don't have to get into the weeds. You see it depicted very, very viscerally in the HBO Watchmen series, which that was probably where most people, I think, heard about Tulsa for the first time. But I really want to give shout out to Nate Powell for putting this into such, it's a very short story. It's, doesn't get into all the detail, but gives you enough of it where you're like, this happened. This was a thing. And just the fact that this guy was how I discovered that story. I just want to, pay tribute to. And
that is in the collection called You Don't Say.
You Don't Say by Nate Powell. Yeah. And there's other stories in there that are equally powerful, really interesting stuff. He's just an incredible talent across the board. So pick up that collection anyway. You're going to see a lot of great, points of view from his head, but that particular story, it's in the middle, and it definitely really shook me.
One thing that stands out to me as you talk about that and the Unwanted is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like both Nate Powell and Don Brown did their own illustration. Yeah. So you're really getting that like unfiltered I mean, it is filtered through them, but it is like that, almost that journalistic quality in the sense of like a personal journal.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. I didn't mention Don Brown also illustrated his work too, but yeah, both guys wrote and illustrated it. Both, took a very considered point of view and gave it as much context as possible. And yeah, it does both feel like, even though even though the Tulsa story is shorter, it does feel very much like there's an immediacy to it. Like you almost feel like both of them could have happened yesterday. And like, these were sort of like, drawn from the field and handed in. And like, here we are reading about these things. So you feel a connection to it that you wouldn't otherwise.
As a reader, are you feeling like, this is this author illustrator also learning about this moment and wanting to communicate it more broadly?
I think so. That's
sort of that
very astute point, perspective. Like you can tell they were as shaken about these things as,
right.
and sort of like, oh my God. And like, other people have to see this. And that clearly comes through the pages as you're flipping through.
Yeah. Just looking at the sample pages, from the Unwanted, I was like, that was the immediate feeling I got of like, this is like a person who just had to communicate out.
Yeah.
What they were reading about.
And who has a ton of empathy for these people. Like drawing them, I mean, you can see like as the Unwanted progresses, going back to that for a second, you can see the characters, like their shoulders start to sloop down the longer they're in this predicament. Like they're sort of their body, the way they carry their bodies, and sort of the faces are very, very simple kind of pencil drawings, but you can see the fear, the shame, or just the exhaustion on their faces and the anger when they sort of start to really get fed up with their predicament. Like it's all very, very human, very clearly human.
Yeah. Wow.
The other book I want to mention, and this is a little trickier because it is very much an anthology. And I'm a little sad I didn't get to it sooner, but again, I actually bought this the same day I bought The Unwanted at Escape Velocity from their well curated, kind of political graphic novel shelf, but it's called Occupy Comics. It was created shortly after Occupy Wall Street, back in 2011, 2012. And it's from 50 different comics creators of all backgrounds, all diverse, all persuasions, it's anybody and everybody. And the back has a very kind of thorough bibliography about this, everything from Alan Moore to Anna, I can never pronounce her name, Anna Weischek, Tyler Crook, Guy Denning, Matt Bors, Ailish Cott. It's a superstar list of different perspectives, but it is, as an art piece, like it tells all these different stories of Occupy Wall Street, either, they're in New York City at the time, or there's one called Homestead, which is about the Pinkertons kind of, taking down a riot in the 1800s, similar sort of mirrored stories. You get kind of one-off pages, it's a simple one-page comic. You get other things that's almost like a piece of Banksy art. So it really, as you're flipping through it, it covers so many different perspectives and points of view. But then you get to the middle, and of course, Alan Moore does an entire 20-page essay, just pure text, about the foment. It's called Buster Brown at the Barricades, Foment and the Funnies and Comics as Counterculture. So it's Alan Moore going to basically giving you a history lesson about how comics and counterculture has worked together, which of all the people to give you that, he's probably top of the list.
And I feel like, I mean, it's like one of those things, like you don't even want to draw attention to this other person. But when I looked up the Wikipedia for Occupy Comics, it tells you so much that you need to know about how good this project must have been when you see that there's a footnote that comic books, fairly racist, curmudgeonly uncle Frank Miller attacked Occupy Wall Street. Like, you're reminded that he wrote basically that bullshit that we're hearing from Trump's mouth now, looking to the wrong parts of the movement as though that characterizes all the positive parts of the movement. or sorry, not even looking at the wrong parts of the movement, just looking at like the people, the thugs and looters who take advantage of an actual positive protest to sort of, sow anarchy. And there's Frank Miller painting with this broad brush like he always does. Just quick reminder that before his other DK3, he wrote a very racist, xenophobic take on Batman that DC rejected.
That's right. God. I want to mention too that Occupy Comics, it did start off as a Kickstarter project.
Yeah.
And so, the crowd, everything about this is so pure. So it's a book of a variety of different perspectives and different takes on the themes of Occupy Wall Street. It's crowdsourced, and so you get the big list of backers at the very beginning. It itself, it functions across so many different dimensions and artistic styles, and you get, by the time you're done with this thing, it feels like an art artifact just in general. I almost wish there was a hardcover version I could have, because it would, I think, even be more meaningful. But you get this beautiful art artifact that I think is just as relevant rereading today, considering how the management of protests has occurred, how splinter groups and things can co-opt protests for their own purposes. You get all of this context from an event that is only 10 years old, barely. God, and just kind of applying that today is so profound.
Yeah, it is. And it goes back to all those, like, the opening frustration that we were talking about on the show. Like, it's been so long, and we are just watching, history repeating itself, I guess, in that way, and hoping that there's forward momentum that comes out of that.
I'm really curious to see, and I don't want this to sound like this could easily sound the wrong way, but I am curious to see what great art gets made during this time that we're talking about, 2, 3, 5, 10 years. Not that you need, I mean, ideally we wouldn't need these events to necessitate great art, but out of, if anything can come out of this stuff, outside of good, positive, progressive change, is the art. Like, how are people kind of immortalizing these moments in personal stories? Like, what's that going to look like? I'm actually, I hesitate to say excited, but I am. I'm kind of like, I'm excited to see how people take this and really do put a personal point of view on it, so that we can, back to your original point, so that future generations, younger people can, from a lack of education, take these pieces and actually get informed and get that context and get, hey, there was a person who was there. This is that story through their point of view, artistically given. And it could be everything from photography to graphic novels and comics, but I'm hoping that a lot of great art will come out of this, much like this Occupy Comics project. I'm hoping there will be a lot more from this particular moment in time too.
Well, I mean, there's for sure stories to be told that we need to, much like my experience with Incognegro, forcing me to, like, confront what did I know about lynchings? Like, everything has been so compressed in this regime of Trump that we're going to have to look back at it through the lens of artists and really, like, to really experience it and feel like, that what can put that fine point on the emotion that I can't even find, because we're living in a pandemic exacerbated by, this horrible man at the top of our country's leadership. Like, it's to a point you made off air of, like, you think of all the good qualities of a human being, and Trump embodies none of them. We've got this is a thing we can't even get a perspective on now.
Yeah.
And
I'll summarize. I'll kind of close by saying too, it's one thing to watch a 5-minute video of a news report of something, or even like somebody's iPhone account of something. It's something to just read a news article, a historic news article, like, let's read about the civil rights movement. We can read about it in books and in news clippings. It's another thing entirely to be presented a thing that is from somebody's very specific point of view, that's artistically done in a medium where you're seeing visually what's going down, and you're able to take it in and consider it. Comics, I've said it already, but comics is uniquely positioned to truly provide the appropriate level of context to some of these very important events that I just don't think any other medium, I mean, even the best documentary can't do what comics can do
exactly
to tell these stories.
I love that you brought that up because, we've quoted this before and I've forgotten the origin of this quote, but some very smart person who said that reading is so like wonderful because you're able to like sort of take an idea and hold it where you're not, you don't have to, like exactly believe it. You can kind of hold it and examine it and play with it and think about it because you're just seeing the words in your head. Yeah. And I think comics pushes it one step beyond that with the visuals. So you're getting to sort of see it, and while you examine that idea in a way that, like you pointed out, is like filmed media doesn't do that because, if you show someone who disagree, a climate change denier, a documentary about climate change, well, they tune out immediately, and they don't have a chance to examine those ideas as they watch the documentary. They've already blocked it. Yeah. But comics has a really unique take on that. So we will be doing more of this. Yeah. I had a little conclusion, which was to say, what do we do from here as sort of human beings? And I take to heart what I've heard from a lot of people, which is like, as a white person, I just need to listen. This is, it's not about me, and I need to support and listen to the people who have those experiences with racial terrorism and the inequality in policing. It's one thing I did this week was I haven't read it yet, so I can't talk about it, but I've purchased the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, which was recommended by people telling me to shut up and listen. The thesis of that book is it's not enough to not be racist. You need to be against racism and understand how thoroughly this pollutes, our thinking and our society and everything. But also to donate. And you've seen everyone else has called out these organizations on social media, but I'll just re-up that and say the Black Visions Collective in Minnesota, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund, and as we mentioned before, CBLDF. They're not directly involved in these recent protests, but it's an organization that does fight for First Amendment freedoms and, is definitely a great resource to keep in business.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, I hope you've enjoyed listening to this. Definitely go out and pick out some of these books. You won't regret it at all.
Yeah.
We'll keep talking about it. We look forward to our discussion about March book 1 and book 2 later this month. So go grab March. It's going to be a really great conversation. I'm blown away by those books. I'll definitely get volume 3. We may talk about that too, but we'll focus on books 1 and 2 because there's so much story there. But if you want I'll just tease it this way. If you want a very immediate, relevant look at the civil rights movement and how they juxtapose to today, you're not going to find a better way to get that information. Like, it's just incredibly well done. And from somebody who's still alive, who was, he's still an active representative in Congress.
John Lewis. Yeah.
John Lewis. Yeah. Who was there, who, went through this and able to kind of provide that then and now back and forth comparison. And then this was obviously published before 2020, but just the parallels are fascinating. So go grab that. We'll talk about that later. And been a great chat, sir. We'll see you next time, and we'll I guess just happy reading.